Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Ettensohn. Welcome to Heal NPD. I want to respond today to a comment that someone left on a recent video of mine about the movie A Real Pain. The commenter noted that the three psychologists that they follow on narcissism, Dr. Ramani, Dr. Peter Salerno, and myself, all have significant disagreements with each other. They asked, what does this say about the state of psychology? And I think that's a fair question. It opens up a deeper discussion about why experts seem to disagree so much about narcissism. What are its essential features? How is it best diagnosed? Can it be effectively treated? How is it that three psychologists can have such seemingly divergent views on the same disorder? I believe the issues stem from how narcissistic personality disorder is defined. NPD, as defined in the DSM, is a contested and deeply problematic construct. As I've said in the past, the diagnostic criteria were revised in the 1980s so that they focused almost entirely on external traits like arrogance and entitlement. This decision stripped the construct of its internal coherence, essentially reducing narcissism to a single factor: grandiosity. That might not seem like a big deal, because grandiosity is, after all, the most obvious outward sign of NPD. But real-life narcissism isn't just grandiosity. And if we went by the DSM's description, that's what we'd think. The DSM construct doesn't line up with clinical reality. It's one of the reasons that NPD, as defined in the DSM, is actually the least diagnosed personality disorder. Even though recent research estimates that up to 20% of patients in outpatient treatment settings struggle with some aspect of pathological narcissism. So how can so many people have issues with narcissism, but so few qualify for a diagnosis of NPD? Well, it's simply a poor construct, and it lacks validity. Clinicians don't like to use it, and the focus on grandiosity actually causes them to miss narcissistic issues when they don't present like the DSM says they should. Many people who are profoundly narcissistic don't look outwardly arrogant or entitled. They may present as shy, depressed, self-effacing, yet be driven internally by classic narcissistic conflicts around self-worth. For more than a century, analysts and researchers have described narcissism as a dialectic, a constant internal tension between states of grandiosity and states of vulnerability. From Freud to Kohut to Kernberg and beyond, extending even into the present decade, the literature has consistently reflected that what looks like arrogance on the outside often conceals despair on the inside, and that these states alternate or coexist in ways that the DSM simply doesn't capture. In their 2010 review, Aaron Pincus and Mark Lukowitzki provide a comprehensive survey of the clinical literature on narcissism from 1971 to 2010, demonstrating the continual interplay of grandiose and vulnerable themes in clinical descriptions of this disorder. I believe the deep divisions and disagreements in the field of psychology concerning narcissism extend from these issues of definition. When you see disagreements between people like myself, Dr. Ramani, and Dr. Salerno, and others, what you're really seeing are different people emphasizing different pieces of this dialectic, or in some cases, ignoring parts of it altogether. The way we define pathological narcissism and NPD has real-world consequences that show up in the wide disparities about how narcissism is represented. In my very first video on this channel, I provided a review of some top-selling books about narcissism, books with titles like How to Kill a Narcissist. In my recent video on moral panic surrounding narcissism, I provided examples of the lurid, scandalizing, and downright paranoid videos about narcissism that you can find on TikTok, YouTube, and other platforms. People have made their careers by whipping up public antagonism based on the DSM model of NPD, which is a construct that's so superficially defined that it can be used to describe almost anyone exhibiting bad or abusive behavior. It stigmatizes people. It confuses loved ones, and it leaves clinicians without a clear map for understanding what's really going on. When we focus only on grandiosity, we get only half the story, leaving us with unanswered questions, the most important of which is, why? If NPD can be collapsed to a single factor, which is grandiosity, if that is truly the engine that drives pathological narcissism, then what causes the grandiosity? Why is it so central to the personality? Why does the person need to be grandiose? Without the vulnerable side of narcissism, the shame, the fragility, the constant fear of not being enough, grandiosity becomes an inexplicable anomaly, an aberration that defies logic and explanation. If grandiosity isn't defensive, that is, if it doesn't protect and compensate for vulnerability in the personality, then what is it based on? Reducing narcissism to a single trait renders it both inexplicable and untreatable. Now juxtapose that with a perspective that includes the whole story, both sides of the dialectic between vulnerability and grandiosity. Suddenly, grandiosity becomes not only explicable, but understandable. We can empathize with a reactive, grandiose self-image that's based on early trauma and the need to defend against re-experiencing of collapse into shame and despair. Not only that, but such a picture actually matches up with what we see in clinical settings, and it gives us a direction to move in treatment. That why question is central, and it's something a unifactorial, trait-based model simply can't answer. And this is why many clinicians, myself included, push back against models that frame narcissism purely in terms of observable behaviors. Those behaviors are often just the tip of an iceberg, without an underlying theory, without attention to unconscious dynamics and underlying personality structure. You're left with a profoundly unsympathetic caricature and no way to think about that person as a complete human being. Nevertheless, regardless of what side of this debate you're on, you can find research that seems to support your perspective. Studies that follow the DSM construct tend to define NPD as grandiosity. They therefore exclude other factors that might yield different results, while other studies that do include vulnerable factors often reach wildly different conclusions. So what does all this mean? Well, basically it means that this area of psychology is still wide open. The construct itself is unsettled. The DSM's reductionism, ironically, leaves us with a poor construct that's so ambiguously defined that it becomes the focus of massive cultural projection. The use of research instruments like the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, that was used in 76% of all research on NPD prior to 2010, and is itself a unidimensional survey based on the DSM criteria for NPD, furthers models of narcissism that are reductive to trait-based grandiosity, while the use of newer instruments like the Pathological Narcissism Inventory, which is a survey that includes both vulnerable and grandiose facets, shows us that pathological narcissism is often associated with more severe mental health issues like depression, self-harm, emotional dysregulation, and even suicide. It's not so much that one side is right and others are wrong. It's more about which model is being used. Some are working with the more unidimensional DSM model. Others, like me, are pushing for a more holistic approach that includes both sides of narcissistic experience: inflation and collapse, grandiosity and vulnerability. Admittedly, it's all quite messy and confusing, but that's what clinical theory looks like in a field that's still developing. And let me underline, these aren't just esoteric academic issues. They have practical consequences. If we mislabel someone as having NPD when they're actually struggling with an entirely different personality structure, let's say BPD, we may miss the actual dynamics driving their suffering and distress. On the flip side, when narcissism presents in a quiet or vulnerable way, we may completely overlook it because it doesn't look like the arrogant caricature we expect. That's not good for patients, and it's not good for their loved ones. The bottom line is this: experts don't disagree because psychology is somehow broken. We disagree because narcissism is a complex, poorly defined construct, and we're in the middle of an active effort to clarify it. And that means that the door is open for research, for theory, and for new clinical perspectives. It also means that for now, when you see conflicting opinions, you're looking at a conversation in progress about one of the most complicated and misunderstood personality structures in all of psychology. Okay, so that's it for today. If you like this and you want to receive videos like these on a weekly basis, consider becoming a paid member of the channel. You can find a link in the description. Also, for individuals living in California, I have reduced fee openings in my practice for psychotherapy and assessment. Reach out through my website at healnpd.org if you're interested. And until next time, take good care.